welcome to Hasty Opera History. I'm your host, Allison. I'm an opera scholar, and I'm here to talk about all things opera with you. I do have a TikTok, so I don't know if any of you came here because of my TikTok channel. But either way, I'm glad that you're here. We're going to talk about opera on this channel in a non-judgmental kind of way, and I'm excited to get into that with you guys. I'm going to be uploading weekly videos up onto this channel. So I release daily videos on TikTok, but I release daily videos on TikTok. I'll release weekly videos here on YouTube. So every Friday, I'll be here for you on YouTube, giving you some opera content. So today's topic is about, we're kind of going to go back in time a little bit to the 17th, 18th, and 19th century in Western Europe to kind of inspect this idea that opera has always been this sort of like highbrow, high culture, elite kind of art form, right? That's not really accessible to the rest of the public. And I'm going to kind of challenge that a little bit because that actually wasn't always true. So yeah, opera is typically viewed as highbrow, high class. It's inaccessible. It's majority white. It's also very expensive. So yeah, I want to kind of challenge a lot of those ideas today in this video. So I think this viewpoint of opera is widely true now. There are a lot of exceptions though. So there are a few grassroots opera organizations. I can think of a few in South Africa and in the US where I'm based. So there's the Isango Ensemble and Umculo in South Africa that are both kind of grassroots organizations. And then there's also here in the States, there's the Lowbrow Opera Collective. There's also the Guerrilla Opera. And these companies are doing new commissions. They're doing kind of like updated productions of older works. They have more racially diverse casts and things like that. So they're kind of challenging this idea that opera is only for a certain type of person. A lot of these opera companies also offer tickets either free or very discounted. They do a lot of like outreach to communities and stuff, educational outreach. So there are these sort of like on the ground opera organizations that are trying to change this viewpoint of opera being this very high art that other people can't understand or afford. But I think the reason, and you can even see some of the changes happening in sort of like the quote unquote mainstream opera industry. I'm sure for those of you that don't really watch operas or attend the opera very often, a lot of you have heard of the Metropolitan Opera House in New York. And an article came out recently in the New York Times. This was written December 26th by Javier Hernandez. And it's an article called Pandemic Woes Lead Met Opera to Tap Endowment and Embrace New Work. And I'm going to kind of go over this article a little bit because it does kind of illustrate how even the mainstream opera industry is trying to sort of update this image of opera being inaccessible. So an endowment is basically an institutional savings account that a place like the Met has. So other big artistic institutions would have an endowment. So it's basically an institutional savings account, and institutions like the Met can withdraw from this account if other means of making money don't really pan out. So it's definitely a last resort. You don't want to have your primary income be this endowment. You want to get things from, ticket sales, marketing, ads, whatever else is going to bring income into your institution. You want to make the endowment the last resort. So the fact that the Met Opera is actually, let me read this part here. Facing tepid ticket sales, the company will withdraw up to $30 million from its endowment and stage more operas by living composers, which have been outselling the classics. So keeping in mind that withdrawing from your endowment is typically a last resort, withdrawing $30 million is a huge deal. That means they really met a lot of profit loss in their previous season if they're withdrawing that much money from their endowment. So let's look more into what this article has to say about the ticket sales. So, hit hard by a cash shortfall and lackluster ticket sales as it tries to lure audiences back amid the pandemic, the Metropolitan Opera said Monday that it would that it would withdraw up to $30 million from its endowment, give fewer performances next season, and accelerate its embrace of contemporary works, which in a shift have been outselling the classics. Okay. The article goes on to say that the Met's decision to stage significantly more contemporary operas is a remarkable turnabout for the company, which largely avoided newer works for many decades because its conservative audience base seemed to prefer war horses like Puccini's La Bohème, Verdi's Aida, and Bizet's Carmen. So what we see here is that the types of operas that the Met has depended on for probably 100 years at this point, if not more, have been operas by Western European composers, primarily from the 19th century, but also from the 18th and 17th centuries, and that the opera-going audience just isn't interested in seeing those operas as much as they used to be. They want to see themselves reflected on the stage, right? They want to see operas that have stories that they care about. They want to see operas that have more diverse casts. They want to see operas that look more like the world they live in. So here we have the Met's music director kind of talking about this shift at the Met. So Mr. Nazé Seguin, who became the Met's music director in 2018, succeeding James Levine, who led the company for 4 decades, said the company would remain committed to the classics even as it embraced innovation. And he said that the company could try to appeal to different audiences with an array of works, both old and new. So things are starting to very slowly change in the opera industry. It's a good sign that one of the world's premier opera houses is starting to change, because that usually means that other opera houses will sort of follow suit. So that could mean that other big opera houses in the States, possibly in Europe, they need to compete with each other, right? So they're going to hopefully they'll start to also start staging more contemporary works and more diverse casts. So how did we get here, though? How did opera become this unattainable and inaccessible art to the point that people are getting ready to abandon going altogether? I think to answer that question, we're going to have to go back to 17th, 18th, and 19th century Europe, specifically Italy, France, Germany, and England. We're going to be jumping back and forth a bit between the countries, but so stay sharp. But I'm going to do my best to make sure that you're staying with me, and we are going to move in chronological order, so I think you'll be able to keep up. All right. So first, let's start in 17th century Europe, and that's sort of the origins of European opera. So opera was initially very highbrow. It did start off that way. It has an Italian origin. The word opera is an Italian word meaning work. So originally it was intended for court audiences. So aka the friends of like kings and emperors and miscellaneous rulers would hire composers to write short operas for them. These operas were, 1, intended to show loyalty to the rulers, and 2, was intended to show off to the court how rich the ruler was, how rich the emperor was, or whoever the ruler was. So it was not only the music, but it was the quality of musicians that you could afford, the types of instruments that you could afford, the costumes, the kind of materials and glitz and glamour of the costumes. It was really intended to showcase wealth to the fellow court members and the elite friends of the court. So basically, the rulers just wanted to show how cool and rich they were to their friends. The stories used at this time were mostly Greek and Roman myths. This is because the stories would have been familiar to the audience members at the time because their education would have included a background in the classics and the literature and mythology of the classics. So the rich people who were seeing these operas liked them so much that they wanted to see them happen more often. So they began to fund their own productions in theaters that were outside of the courts. This is the first time that we see opera taken out of the court and into, not public, but a more public venue like a theater. But this was still mostly just performed for other rich people, which is still people putting on operas that only themselves and their friends wanted to see. So then we have the first public opera house open in Venice in 1637. You can see it here in this photo. So the public could attend operas at this theater, and they did pay for tickets, but most of the money came from the box tickets for the season. So if you can see up here on kind of like the left and right parts of the picture, there's like these sort of, these box seats basically. So wealthy people would rent basically these boxes for the entire season, and the rent for those boxes is what was the primary funder of these theaters. And that was so they didn't have to, really interact with the riffraff on the main floor. So the public, the tickets were much cheaper, obviously, than renting a box, and they just stood on the main floor. There wasn't actual seating for them. So I'm going to read a couple of excerpts by this Venetian historian called Cristofor Ivanovich. In 1681, he wrote a book called Minerva al Tavolino, or Minerva at her desk. So we see Ivanovich talking about the ways that the theater was able to be filled up. So he says, and more important, the diversity of the prices of admission facilitates greater attendance. For the nobility and merchants, thanks to their income and commerce, have the means to be continually satisfied, as do the common people, prices being very much lower now than they were before. So he acknowledges that before the public was allowed to come into the theaters, that there weren't a lot of people attending, and that now that there are more people being able to attend, it's sort of a more fun experience having a full theater. So here we have a ticket, and this is from the Biblioteca del Civico Museo Correr. And we have this is a ticket that the public would have bought to attend this theater, and it cost, you can see at the bottom here, it says it costs for a lyre. In today's money, that's about 20 cents. So it's pretty affordable. It was pretty affordable for the public to actually attend operas at this opera house in Venice that opened up. The content did change a bit to please the public. So there were a lot of like vocal acrobatics, these long florid arias became more common. The spectacle was, more on the voice rather than the costumes and the instruments and other things like that. The public just didn't really care that much about the costumes. They didn't really care that much about the instruments. Those are symbols of wealth that don't really translate to like your average working class 17th century Italian. They likely wouldn't have really understood like, oh, that material is expensive. Oh, that instrument must have cost this much money. They didn't really care about that. They wanted to come and see these singers sing in this way that they had never seen before. So that was what they focused on. So because they were more interested in that, the style of Italian operatic singing did change a bit. So now it's like these big long lines and people doing these huge, long florid lines. So Ivanovich didn't like that though. Ivanovich did like that the theaters are more full, right? But he was not a fan of the way that the content of the operas, the styles of the operas were changing. So let's read a little bit about how he complains about that here. So all the above expenses have changed with the times. For when the theaters were just starting, prices were not so high. Discretion and honesty were still respected, and the efforts of virtuosos were more welcome and appreciated. Today, dispositions are so insatiable that loss rather than gain is the rule. And for the most part, one spends far more than one gains because of the exorbitant payments to the singers. In earlier days, 2 exquisite voices sufficed. A small number of arias gave pleasure. A few changes of scenery satisfied curiosity. Nowadays, one unsuitable voice receives more attention than the best voices in Europe. Every scene in the drama is expected to entail a change of scenery, and the invention of the machines must be extravagant. These are the reasons why expenses grow heavier every year. But in reality, they do not grow, for payments at the door are becoming less expensive, putting the continuance of the theaters at risk, unless a better regulation is imposed on the current trends. So we see here that Ivanovich isn't really super excited about the changes that are coming to opera. We can also see that the changes coming to opera are directly being influenced by the public. They made it clear what they liked, because at the time, you didn't sit quietly and watch opera. You would cheer. Like when these singers were doing their big florid arias, the people in the audience, especially the public who was just standing on the floor, would be cheering. They would be like, yes, that's like my favorite singer. And the more they kept cheering, the singer would kind of like keep embellishing their line to kind of please them. So it was a back and forth definitely between the vocalists and the public. So to people like Ivanovich, who would have been more elite, that was definitely kind of like a degradation of the art form, I think. So we do see here that the public is having a direct influence on what is being produced and what the opera house, this theater thought was profitable. And I remember reading this passage and kind of going back to that passage from the New York Times, that there's, even when it's desired to the public, there's still this resistance to change, to innovation. And that the reason not to innovate is always money. That's always the reason not to innovate. But yet, at the same time, it seems like the innovation is bringing in more money. So we can see that there's like this, common kind of thread between 17th century Italy and 21st century America, is that the public makes clear what they want, and these elite institutions kind of don't want to change it, and they always cite money as the reason. Let's move on a bit. Let's move on to the 18th century. I just wanted to kind of get the start there. Opera didn't really move to other countries in Europe until the 18th century. There was like a bit of it moving around in the 17th century, but for the most part, it was just Italian court operas being sung in different courts in different countries. So the development of like German opera in German, French opera in French, and those countries' own theaters and things didn't really come along until the 18th century. So in the 18th century, we see the development of comic operas, and also operas in French, English, and German, where they had previously only been in Italian. So the comic operas had wide public appeal. They were funny. People really liked to see funny operas. As I said before, these Italian court operas were mostly Greek and Roman mythologies, which are not funny, so very serious stories for the most part. But these comic operas had wide public appeal. And because they were so popular with the public, Italy, Germany, France, I'm forgetting one. Italy, Germany, France, and England, there we go. In England, all developed their own versions of this. So let's start with Italy. And this is a type of opera called opera buffa. So opera buffa was intended for the middle class. So this is the first time that we actually see an opera genre explicitly made for the middle class. Not a high genre that's kind of adjusted a little bit, but this was explicitly designed for the middle class. It did eventually become popular with the higher classes later, but at first it was only for the middle class. So an example of this is Piccinni's La Cecchina in 1760. I would love to play a lot of these operas for you. I'm going to give you examples. I'm always worried about copyright claim with YouTube, so I'm going to give you the examples. You can kind of go check them out yourself, but I'm not going to play any of them in the video because I'm just really worried about copyright claim. So opera buffas were performed in public theaters. So Italy did start building public theaters outside of Venice. They were popping up all over Italy. And the plots of these operas usually poked fun at the aristocracy. So again, complete opposite of these court operas where they were supposed to be, to express loyalty to the aristocracy, to the court. These operas explicitly made fun of the aristocracy. They often used national folk songs or other songs that the general public would have known. So the music wasn't entirely unfamiliar with them either. So that was another way to kind of gather the public. And this is when we see the public in Italy shift from wanting to see these vocal acrobatics that they liked in the 17th century. Now they want to hear recognizable songs that they can follow. So songs that they can hum on the way home. So even if they don't recognize a song going in, they want a song that's like easy to follow, and that they can kind of, can be an earworm and kind of stick in their head after they're done attending the opera. Another genre that pops up in Italy at this time is called an intermezzo. So unlike the opera buffa, these were performed between the scenes of serious operas. So these are not standalone works like opera buffa. An example of this is Pergolesi's La Serva Padrona of 1733. And so because these intermezzi, which is the plural, were performed between the scenes of serious opera, they were initially performed primarily for elite audiences, because elite audiences would have been the people who were attending serious operas. But they were eventually performed in public theaters as well. But this does show that how comic opera, which was intended for public audiences, was slowly becoming the opera norm, right? Even started to infect the serious operas of these elite opera theaters of the court and things like that. So the plots of Intermezzi also parodied the aristocracy and sometimes even parodied the sort of like over-the-top nature of opera, which was common in serious opera still. The serious opera still had all the vocal acrobatics and all of the grandeur. So basically Intermezzi were operas that made fun of opera within an opera. So they're like super meta. People responded to them very well, kind of across class. So I'm just going to show a picture of a intermezzo here. So you see there's these two people on the stage, right? And then you see in front of this like miniature, this half wall, way towards the front of the stage, there would have been a small orchestra. And by small, I mean like 5 to 10 people, like very small. And you see some people standing behind them, and then you see other people kind of standing behind this half wall. And what this picture shows is that, like in the 17th century, people weren't sitting down quietly and listening to operas. You can see that people are talking. You can see these group of 4 guys standing by the wall. They're definitely having a chat while they're watching this. They're not staying super quiet. You can see there's a conversation going on to the left. People are kind of milling about. So I'm just showing still that there wasn't this sort of like quiet reverence for opera yet, like we have now. So comic opera, the popularity of that was starting to kind of infiltrate serious opera in Italy at the time. So even though comic and serious operas were still sort of separated in Italy at this point, the changes that happened to serious operas did kind of show how popular comic opera was becoming. So these, florid acrobatic arias that went on for a long time started to change in the 18th century Italy. So they became more melody forward. They had shorter phrases. So phrases are basically, how do I explain a phrase? So phrases are basically the parts of the song that you sing in one breath. So, the part of a song that you sing one breath, that's a phrase. That's a very simple way of explaining it. So the composers at the time were adjusting the melodies in serious operas to be more melody forward and to have shorter phrases so you could actually leave the theater humming them. So they were starting to construct the arias to reflect the arias in comic operas that are a little bit easier to understand, easier to follow. So let's move on to France. So France's iteration of comic opera was called opera comique. And unlike opera buffa, opera comique did have moments of spoken dialogue. Opera buffa was sung throughout. So also this introduction of spoken dialogue to opera was another result of appealing to the public because the spoken dialogue made the story of the opera easier to follow so that you're not having to follow these songs all the time and like try to figure out what's going on from the songs because the lyrics and the words are just too much. The spoken dialogue makes it easier to understand what's going on in the plot. So an example of this is Grétry's The Judgment of Midas from 1778. So similar to opera buffa, opera comique began as something that was intended for the public but evolved over the course of the 18th century. So it also initially consisted of almost entirely popular songs, folk songs that people would have already known going in. These were performed at fairs initially that were attended by middle and working class people. And these also included ballet, which remember is a French method of dancing. So these, were intended to catch the eye of working class people as they were kind of doing their shopping and having fun at fairs. So France wanted to compete with Italy to create a wider and more national genre of comic opera. So in the mid-18th century, composers began to write original songs to put into the operas. So initially these original songs were mixed into opera comique, but eventually opera comique became all original music, and they stopped using the folk songs as much. But similarly to opera buffa, they did kind of try to make the music easier to follow, for sure. France, at this time, also started constructing separate theaters for comic and serious operas. So just like in Italy, French comic opera over time began to appeal to the higher classes as well. So France maintained these separate theaters. So if you really wanted to see a serious opera, you could go to this theater. If you wanted to really see a comic opera, you could go to this theater. So in France, we do see a similar trajectory where they start building theaters to house these comic operas that are intended for the middle class, but eventually the more elite class enjoys them as well. So Germany in the 18th century, their comic opera is called a Singspiel. And Singspiel contain German folk songs and some newly composed works and spoken dialogue. An example of that is Mozart's Magic Flute of 1791. Singspiel were so popular in Germany that the songs were actually published into songbooks that people could play at home for entertainment. So this is what was called parlor music, and it was a very popular form of entertainment in both the 18th and 19th centuries, not just in Germany, but in Europe in general. So people would gather in the parlors of their homes, and someone would sit at the piano and play songs out of a songbook, and other people would sing along. So Singspiels were becoming so popular that that songbooks of individual songs from Singspiel were published, and people could sing them at home. So it was even possible that you could be a German person who had never actually seen a Singspiel, but you still had gone to a parlor to someone's house and sat with them and listened to the music. So you could still know these songs even if you hadn't seen the opera. And so this parlor music kind of repertoire was spreading rapidly throughout Europe, and we'll see more of that definitely in the 19th century. And then in England in the 18th century, also, you had ballad opera. An example of this is Gay and Pepusch's Beggar's Opera of 1728, and these were comic operas with spoken dialogue. So these differ a little bit from the other versions of comic opera. So ballad operas used the music from popular songs, but they had new words. So you recognize the tune, but it was different lyrics. So that's like a little bit different from the way that opera comique in France and Singspiel in Germany used popular music. But it is similar to opera comique in that over time, composers began to compose new songs for ballad operas, and eventually ballad operas only contained newly composed music. And these were written explicitly for the public as well. So all of these forms of comic opera were explicitly written for the public. All but Italy used spoken dialogue to make the plot easier to understand. All of them, you wanted to write simpler music so that people could kind of follow along with the music and understand it better. And most of them used folk songs or folk tunes or something that people would have known already going into the theater at some point. So we've seen how in the 18th century, not only did opera written explicitly for the public boom, we also saw how the new public and the middle class interest in opera influenced changes in how opera was written. Both the public and aristocrats became interested in watching operas that were catchy and easy to follow, rather than overly florid in both song and costume. And at least in France, we get a glimpse of why upper-class opera traditionalists and fans of serious opera opposed these changes. These changes cut into their leisure time. As seen published in French literary magazine Mercure de France in 1774. So let me read a little excerpt from that. The old pillars of French opera cry that we shall be deprived of the genre in which we have succeeded, and get nothing better in exchange. They complain that instead of being able to sleep, as is the custom during a scene, they are obliged to listen to it, since nothing else is interesting, the ballets being the most insipid thing in the world, the ballets which ought forever to constitute the glory and delight of such a spectacle. So we see here that for the aristocrats, opera was actually leisure time. It wasn't actually like, let me sit quietly, listen to this. They were sleeping. They were getting sloshed. They drank a lot while they were watching operas. So they're actually mad about the changes to opera because the public liked it so much they would cheer and everything. It kind of was ruining the sleepy time of the French aristocrats. But it just goes to show that, yeah, even for the aristocrats, this idea of sitting quietly and respecting the theater and things like that weren't really happening yet. So the changes in the practices of acceptable theater behavior and acceptable ways to watch opera are largely what made opera to not only be considered highbrow, but also to be considered boring. A lot of these practices were ossified in the 19th century and carry into today. So I think before I move on to that and sort of give you an idea of how opera got to this highbrow, boring state that it's in, I want to give you a glimpse at like the absolute chaos and filth that was opera houses in the 18th century. These were definitely not the sites of opulence, I think, that people often imagine. Okay, so remember when I showed that example of that Venetian public theater from the 17th century? And the rich people would rent these boxes for the season so that the theater could have income. Okay, so you can't tell in the picture, but behind these boxes, there's hallways. And that is actually where the aristocrats would spend most of their time during the opera. So in those hallways, they'd have like butlers and servants and other people back there giving them drinks. So they would be getting sloshed and socializing like most of the time, like drinking like full-on cocktails, just getting up to all kinds of like no good. They were not making good choices. And they usually only came out of those hallways to watch like the big aria performances and cheer, and they were so drunk and so loud. So mostly opera for them was socializing and drinking. It wasn't actually this like sitting quietly and watching kind of idea. So I'm going to read you this excerpt from a French opera house, and this would have been in 1751, so in the 18th century. And keep in mind the guy that they're talking about in this excerpt, it was an aristocrat. This was not someone of the lower class. So the open display of bodily functions in a public space such as the parterre could also disrupt many standard assumptions of social rank and practice. I feel like I want to interrupt here. A parterre is like the sort of the edges of the flat open space where the public was standing. So the sort of the parts like underneath the balcony maybe, and along the border of that area. So on 18 August 1751, the police arrested the tax farmer Berth, an extremely wealthy venal office holder, for allegedly urinating in the parterre of the Comédie Française. Berth, do you think it's Berth or Bert? We're going with Berth. Berth already experienced intermittent paralysis in his left arm and leg, a condition that had prompted him to visit the wine country to soak his leg in Marc de Vin. The sergeant who arrested Berth, is that what I said I was going with? Berth. The sergeant who arrested Berth wrote that he had taken action against the tax farmer for having pissed in the parterre without any precaution, for making insulting remarks to the guard. It is unclear what the absence of any precaution might mean, but in his plea for release to the Lieutenant General of Police, Berth stated that he had been falsely accused of having pissed against the orchestra while seated on a small bench in the parterre. But the scholar goes on to say that male bodies in the parterre thus ate, drank, broke wind, defecated, and urinated. They also experienced sexual desire, if we can believe even a fraction of the accounts left behind in journals, novels, and other sources. So this gives you an idea of what was going on, at least in the French 18th century opera houses, that the floor in front of the stage and behind the orchestra. So imagine being in the orchestra and trying to like actually perform this opera, and there's just like people like peeing like right behind you. So that space was just like peeing and like farting and like I don't even want to know what else is going on there. Women were not allowed in that spot for those exact reasons. It was just like too inappropriate for them to be there because men were just kind of like doing the most in those areas. It wasn't much more classy in England. So speaking of parterres, in England, there's the 1784 watercolor by Robert Dighton. Just to give you an idea. So first, there's just this dude in the center who's just straight up vomiting. You also see these spikes kind of along here. These spikes were used for crowd control because people would get in fights, they would crowd the stage, they would do all kinds of things. So these spikes were to actually stop people from trampling each other. And then you also see these ladies' hats on the ground. So I don't know if that means at some point there were ladies here who just abandoned this place, which I understand, or if the men stole the hats. I'm not really sure what happened here, but something bad happened. And yeah, so that's just to show you that England and France were equally chaotic when it came to how opera performances were attended in the 18th century. And I won't quote a lot of the stuff that I've been sort of finding in my research, but, you know, just in case you're eating lunch. But remember that indoor plumbing, all I'm going to say is that remember that indoor plumbing wasn't a thing in Europe at this time, in the 18th century. And also in Europe at this time, most people, including the aristocracy, didn't bathe every day. They wore a lot of cologne. They usually washed their face their armpits and sort of their business. But they didn't actually like take a full-on bath like every day. That was maybe like a weekly thing. So I'm just trying to paint for you a scented picture of the olfactory experience that 18th century European opera houses would have been. So you have all this cologne, you have all this perfume, and just the smell of just like waste just mixing together. So yeah, what happened? Like, how did we go from this like smelly chaos to what opera is now? So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the 19th century. So in the 19th century in Europe, the primary stages are still Germany, France, Italy, and England. Russians and Americans were starting to get involved at this time with opera, but that solidified more in the 20th century. So in the 19th century, the countries we've been talking about are still the major players. Opera audiences at this time still do consist of an array of classes, so low, middle, and high class. But opera is starting to become a sort of dog whistle for the elite class, as initially was in the 17th century. And there's a few reasons for that. So first, opera became more expensive. Let me show you this picture of an opera ticket. This is for Meyerbeer's opera Les Huguenots in France. This line right here basically says that free tickets won't be accepted. So already you can kind of see in 1836 that the public was being discouraged to attend opera, that theaters are becoming less interested in offering inexpensive tickets to see opera. So we do start to see this solidifying of opera as more of a high class thing, this return to opera as a more high class thing. So because of these increasing ticket prices and things like that, the low and middle classes were most experiencing opera via parlor music or other media. So remember I told you that these songbooks, people would buy them that had opera songs in them and they would play them at home. So people were still doing that. And the public, now that they weren't really attending opera theaters as much anymore, now they were putting opera songs in puppet show parodies. So they would parody operas with puppets. There were amateur performers in cafes who just sing songs from operas in pubs, things like that. There were burlesque shows that parodied the operas. So the public just didn't really stop listening to opera or singing opera or anything like that. They just put it in venues that were available to them. So there definitely still is a side of opera that is not this high-class thing that is starting to become. So because the ticket prices were getting higher and everything like that, and they're becoming more exclusionary, the theaters becoming more exclusionary, going to the theater to see an opera started to become a way to solidify your social standing or to attempt to increase your social standing. So let's go to Italy. So in the 19th century, one of the more popular composers was Rossini. He wrote Barber of Seville, which premiered in 1816, and that was actually an opera buffa. So in Italy, we do still have comic and serious operas. There still is an emphasis on understandable plots or natural-sounding songs, things like that. But serious operas were making a major comeback, and remember that serious operas were still really only popular with aristocrats. They didn't really the public didn't really latch on to serious operas in the same way because those operas weren't being performed in the theaters that the public was allowed to attend. So Italy is like kind of still catering to the public, at least composers like Rossini are, but there also is a turn away from, there's also a turn to a genre of opera that the public doesn't like as much. So Italy is definitely trying to turn away a little bit from the public, the more middle-class audience. And then in France, like Italy, France still had comic operas, but there was a different serious genre that emerged and then it really gained popularity through the 19th century. And it was called grand opera. So grand opera was basically a return to the spectacle that would have been popular in the 17th century courts. So costumes and machinery and really long, complicated plots and long, complicated arias and, things that showed opulence and wealth. An example of this would have been Meyerbeer's Les Huguenots, which you saw the ticket for, or the advertisement for, and the free tickets were not allowed. And that opera premiered in 1836. So there were ballets, there were stage machines, there were these huge casts. The plots were about kind of love and historical themes rather than making fun of the aristocracy. And the emerging middle and upper classes after the French Revolution really wanted to solidify their social statuses by investing in opera. So they not only were investing in these grand operas, they were going to see them to kind of mark themselves as someone who is emerging as a elite person in France after the revolution. And then in Germany in the 19th century, so Germany still stuck to Singspiel for the first half of the 19th century. And that was because they really wanted to present a national idiom of opera. In the 19th century in Europe, we see countries really wanting to solidify their like national identity, and that was through a lot of things. Opera was one of them. That was through other forms of art, literature, government, whatever it was. They really wanted to make their stamp as like, this is Germany, this is Italy, et cetera, et cetera. So in like the first half of the 19th century, Germany kind of stuck to its like Singspiel and folk songs. That's how we're going to be Germany. That's how we're going to present it. So it didn't change a lot in the first half of the 19th century. But the second half of the 19th century, so the 1850s on, opera changes a lot in Germany. So they still want a nationalist idiom, but the way they want to go about that in Germany kind of changes. So new works are not being produced nearly as often. And this sort of canon of works emerges. So that consists of composers from the first half of the 19th century. Some of Mozart's late works are becoming the norm for opera theaters. There's a disinvestment in new commissions in Germany at the time. And that was partially due to public demand. People wanted to hear their favorites. They wanted to hear the operas they already knew repeatedly. They also wanted to hear the singers they already liked in those roles. So we do kind of see that happening in the second half of the 19th century. What we also see happening is that because operas are being commissioned less often, the operas that are being written in the second half of the 19th century are much longer and more complex. Composers have more time to put these operas out because they don't have as many commissions as they used to have. So operas that were 2 to 3 hours maximum can now be as long as 4 to 6 hours. So we see this kind of like these two kind of sides of opera emerging in Germany in the second half of the 19th century, which was like the more public, like, yes, I love the magic flute. I just want to keep hearing the magic flute. I want to hear my favorite singer do the magic flute. I just want to keep hearing that. And then you also had composers like Wagner who are starting to write these longer operas because they have more time because they're getting fewer commissions. So the difference in those types of operas did create a split between the middle and high class audience members. The public just had no interest. They had no interest in sitting through these increasingly complex and long operas. So even though composers like Verdi and Rossini in Italy were still appealing to the public with like the more simpler plots and accessible music, you had composers like Wagner in Germany that only wanted to appeal to aristocratic audiences. Wagner definitely thought himself the voice of his country. And he is actually sort of the one who introduced these ideas about opera audience behavior, the construction of theaters, and the sort of like behavioral practices that we have today, where opera is supposed to be this, you sit quietly in the theater, you don't make any noise, you don't clap until the end, you don't talk to people around you, you don't pee everywhere, which, I mean, I'm okay with that. You don't talk to the people around you, you don't, you just sit quietly, you dress nice, you watch the opera, and then at the end you clap and then you leave. So Wagner didn't like that there was this rift in opera. He wanted to kind of have more control over how people watched opera in Germany and what operas they watched. So he constructed this theater, I'm going to show it on the screen right here, called the Bayreuth Festspielhaus. It's still there in Bayreuth, Germany. So he designed this building, and it opened in 1876. This building was made to put on Wagner's operas, and every summer in Germany they still do. They put on a series of his operas called the Ring Cycle. And it's kind of hard to tell, but I think you can see here that there's no way out, okay? There's only one aisle on each side of the theater. So this is a huge theater. And there's no middle aisle. There's just this one aisle on the far right and then another aisle on the far left. So there is no way out of this theater. You are in your seat in this theater for the whole 4 to 6 hours that you're watching a Wagner opera, because there just isn't a way out. You'd have to crawl across like 20 plus people to get out of the theater. He designed the vestibule house this way intentionally to discourage any socialization among members. You can see there's no room to socialize on the floor, right? So we see seats on the floor where there weren't seats before. There's no balcony seating. So there's not this idea of you going into the hallways and drinking during the opera. Everyone, no matter your class, is seated on the floor facing the stage, and the way it's constructed, there's not really a way out while you're watching the opera. So that it kind of like, solidified this idea of opera as like this penance that you have to get through. And it really originated with Wagner and with this theater, and it's a tradition that we still carry today. So just to wrap up, opera was still enjoyed by the public during and by the end of the 19th century. Wagner didn't have as much of an influence as he wanted to. However, this enjoyment was primarily outside of the opera house. In England, France, Germany, and Italy, the public enjoyed opera in pubs and burlesque shows, cafes, and parlors with their friends. But as the canon ossified and composers were no longer at the mercy of a demanding public, opera, its discretion, its artistry, and its content began to be almost exclusively decided by a small group of wealthy elite patrons. Though government subsidies were also common in Europe and still are, such subsidies did little to encourage public access to opera houses because doing so could alienate the wealthy donors that kept the industry going. Though European opera houses are now largely owned entirely by the government and therefore don't require wealthy patrons to turn a profit, they still primarily perform operas from a canon that was ossified in the mid-19th century. In the US, opera houses are privately owned, meaning that their income is almost entirely dependent on wealthy donors. Either way, Euro-American opera houses are primarily prioritizing these canonic works at the detriment of drawing in diverse publics. While I'm not interested in bringing back the unchecked urinary practices of 18th century opera houses, I would like to bring back the excitement that the public had to see new works that resonate with them and encourage them to connect with their fellow audience members. I hope that the Met stays true to its word and that the future of opera, at least in the US, will begin to appeal to a wider public and draw from the diverse talent of today's opera composers. So that's what I have for you today. Thanks for watching so much. Please leave any comments and questions down below. Make sure you check the description box for the sources that I used in this. Like, subscribe, ring that bell so you know when I'm uploading new stuff. And thanks for watching. Bye.